The whole neighborhood laughed at him, until winter forced them to stop. A retired veteran living quietly in Duluth, Minnesota, built what everyone called a double cabin, a strange structure meant to defy the cold. They said he was wasting his final years fighting nature. But when a 5-day blizzard froze the entire city, that narrow covered passage became the only safe way through the storm. As neighbors began knocking on his door in the middle of the whiteout, and his loyal German shepherd stood guard against the wind, they finally understood why he had never feared winter. What he built wasn't just wood and nails, it was a lifeline. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these survival stories travel. Winter arrived early in Duluth, Minnesota, dragging cold winds off Lake Superior that sliced through streets, trees, and bone alike, as if the city itself were being tested for weaknesses. Frank Miller had lived through colder things than weather. At 73, his body was tall but slightly stooped, shoulders permanently rounded forward as if still bracing under a heavy pack. His face was deeply lined, the kind carved by wind, age, and long silences rather than talk. A square jaw sat beneath a neatly trimmed gray beard, and his eyes, pale blue and watchful, carried the distant look of a man who had learned long ago that danger often arrived quietly. He wore the same thing almost every day once autumn faded, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, heavy with years of use, its elbows patched, its cuffs frayed, its warmth proven. It was not a fashion choice. It was armor. Frank lived alone in a weather-darkened wooden cabin on the outskirts of town, where the road thinned into gravel and the lake winds had nothing left to break them. He had built the cabin himself decades earlier, shortly after returning from the war, back when his hands were steadier and his nights louder. The war had left him with a limp in his right leg, courtesy of shrapnel that doctors said he was lucky to survive. It had also left him with something less visible, an intolerance for chaos, and an obsession with preparation. Frank did not panic. He planned. When things went wrong, he wanted options. That mindset followed him into civilian life, shaping his relationships and isolating him from most of the town. He was polite but distant, friendly without being familiar. He waved to neighbors but rarely joined them. He trusted few people, not because he disliked them, but because trust, like warmth, had to be earned. The one creature who never had to earn it was Shadow. Shadow was a German shepherd nearing 9 years old, large even for his breed, with a thick sable coat that faded from deep black along his back to smoky brown along his legs and face. His ears stood permanently alert, one slightly scarred from a winter accident years earlier, and his amber eyes followed Frank with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Shadow moved with quiet confidence, the kind that came from knowing his role and accepting it fully. He did not bark unnecessarily. He did not wander. Wherever Frank went, Shadow followed at a respectful distance, close enough to protect, far enough not to crowd. People sometimes joked that the dog looked like he was still on patrol. Frank never corrected them. The idea came to Frank one evening as he watched the first heavy snow of the season pile against his porch steps. He had just returned from the shed, his boots soaked, his joints aching from the cold bite of the wind. The short walk less than 30 yards had taken more effort than it should have. He stood inside the cabin afterward, peeling off gloves with stiff fingers, irritation simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. He knew winters here were growing more unpredictable, storms lasting longer, power outages stretching into days. He knew what happened to people who underestimated exposure. That night, By the dim yellow light of a single lamp, Frank sketched. His handwriting was blocky and deliberate, the way it had been trained decades earlier. 2 structures. 1 main cabin, 1 auxiliary space, and between them a raised, covered passage, enclosed enough to block wind, elevated enough to avoid drifting snow, a way to move without stepping into danger. He began construction 3 weeks later. The second cabin went up first, smaller and simpler than the main house, positioned roughly 25 feet away. Frank worked slowly, methodically, pausing often to stretch his leg or catch his breath, but never rushing. Shadow supervised from various vantage points, sometimes lying across the porch, sometimes pacing the perimeter, occasionally placing his heavy paws onto newly set boards as if testing their resolve. The neighbors noticed, of course. Duluth was not a place where odd behavior went unseen. Among the onlookers was Sarah Whitman, who lived 2 houses down with her husband. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with narrow shoulders and a posture shaped by years of standing rather than sitting. Her hair was a muted chestnut brown, usually pulled back into a low ponytail that revealed a pale, wind-kissed face and sharp, observant eyes. She had worked as a nurse before the hospital downsized, and the job had left its mark on her demeanor. Calm under pressure, quietly empathetic, and unafraid of uncomfortable truths. She watched Frank's work with curiosity rather than judgment, her gloved hands often tucked into her coat pockets as she stood at the edge of her property line, head tilted slightly, studying the angles. Others were less kind. Tom Reeves, a stocky man in his late 50s with a perpetually red face and a booming voice, made a point of laughing loudly whenever he passed. His beard was unkempt, his belly straining against his jacket, and his tone carried the practiced confidence of someone used to being heard. "Building a sky hallway now, Frank?" he called out one afternoon. "Planning to fly between cabins?" The laughter that followed was not cruel, but it was dismissive. Frank didn't look up. He measured again, adjusted a beam, drove another nail. Silence had always been his answer. The passage was what truly unsettled people. Posts sunk deep into frozen ground, rising high enough to lift the walkway above expected snowdrifts. A peaked roof angled just right, neither too steep nor too shallow. Slatted side walls designed to block direct wind without trapping moisture. It looked strange, almost out of place, like a structure borrowed from another climate or another century. Children pointed. Adults shook their heads. Words like crazy, wasteful, and stubborn floated freely. Frank heard none of it, and all of it. Every night, as he sat alone with Shadow's head resting against his knee, memories surfaced uninvited. Long nights overseas, moving between tents under fire, understanding the cost of exposure. The men who hadn't made it back because they'd been caught in the open. He had learned then that survival often depended on the small, unglamorous decisions no one applauded. Build cover, create routes, reduce risk. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to endure. By the time the first real storm warnings began to circulate on the radio, the passage was halfway complete. Frank stood inside it one evening, testing the floor beneath his boots, listening to the wind whistle harmlessly along the outer slats. Shadow walked its length beside him, nails clicking softly against wood, tail steady, calm. Frank rested his hand against one of the posts and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not pride, exactly, but certainty. They could laugh. Winter would answer. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It thinned the way daylight does in winter, retreating slowly, reluctantly, until only a pale trace remained. As November tightened its grip on Duluth, the wind off Lake Superior grew sharper, carrying with it the kind of cold that didn't announce itself loudly, but instead settled deep into joints, into walls, into doubt. Frank Miller felt it every morning when he stepped outside, the ache in his right leg flaring like an old memory that refused to fade. He welcomed it in a way that would have seemed strange to others. Pain, at least, was honest. It told you where you stood. The neighborhood had opinions, and they shared them freely. Some suggested Frank should sell his property and move closer to town, where plowed roads and emergency services might soften his stubborn independence. Others spoke in softer tones, the way people do when they believe kindness lies in surrender, urging him toward assisted living, toward warmth that came without effort. Frank listened with the same expression he had worn during debriefings decades earlier, neutral, attentive, unmoved. He thanked them. He did not explain himself. Experience had taught him that explanations invited arguments, and arguments wasted energy better spent preparing. Each day he returned to the passage, measuring, adjusting, refining. His movements were deliberate, economical, shaped by years when unnecessary motion could get a man killed. He checked angles twice, sometimes 3 times, running calloused fingers along beams to feel imperfections his eyes might miss. He built the roof pitch carefully, calculating how snow would slide, where ice might form, how weight would distribute under pressure. The slatted walls were a point of particular fascination to the onlookers, who couldn't understand why he would leave gaps on purpose. Frank understood airflow. He understood moisture. He understood that fighting nature head-on often meant losing. Shadow remained his constant shadow, true to his name. The German shepherd aged with quiet dignity, muzzle dusted with gray now, muscles still strong beneath his thick coat. He moved ahead of Frank on the unfinished walkway, testing boards with slow, deliberate steps, pausing when something felt off. When Shadow stopped, Frank stopped. When the dog continued, Frank followed. It was not sentimentality. It was trust forged over years of shared storms, shared silence, shared survival. To Frank, Shadow was not just a companion, but a second set of instincts, sharpened by loyalty. Sarah Whitman continued to watch from a distance, her presence becoming a familiar constant. She was tall and spare, her movements efficient, her posture straight despite the cold. Her skin carried the faint redness of someone accustomed to harsh weather, and her eyes, gray, observant, missed little. She didn't laugh. She didn't offer advice. One afternoon, when Frank paused to rest against a post, she approached quietly, boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. She asked simple questions about the structure, about how high the passage would sit once finished. Her voice was calm, professional, shaped by years of explaining hard truths to frightened patients. Frank answered just as simply. When she nodded, considering his responses, he sensed understanding rather than judgment. It unsettled him more than mockery ever had. Tom Reeves remained unconvinced. He grew louder as temperatures dropped, his jokes sharpened by the creeping fear he would never admit to feeling. Reeves was a broad man with a heavy gait, his beard uneven, his laugh too quick, too forced. He had lived in Duluth his entire life and believed familiarity equaled mastery. Winter had never beaten him before, and he took that as proof it never would. When he saw Frank reinforcing joints or adding extra bracing, he scoffed openly, calling it overkill. Frank didn't respond. He had seen men like Reeves before, brave until bravery failed them. By late November, snow came in earnest. Not yet the blizzard the forecasts warned of, but enough to test resolve. Frank woke one morning to find drifts already forming around the base of his posts. He walked the passage carefully, boots thudding softly against the boards, noting how the elevated floor remained clear, while the ground below vanished beneath white. The roof shed snow exactly as planned, clean lines forming where accumulation slid away. Inside the passage, the wind dulled to a low whisper, stripped of its teeth. Frank closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the scent of fresh wood and cold air, feeling a tightness in his chest ease. This was why he built. Not to prove anything. To breathe. That afternoon, he saw fewer people outside. Laughter gave way to hurried movements, to faces pulled tight beneath scarves. Doors closed earlier. Lights flickered as power strained under demand. Sarah stopped by briefly, bringing over extra batteries. "Just in case," she said, her lips pressed into a thin smile. Frank accepted them without comment, the gesture settling somewhere deep in his chest. Trust, he realized, could grow quietly, like frost. At night, as the wind rose and the radio crackled with storm warnings, Frank sat at his table, sharpening tools that didn't need sharpening, an old habit resurfacing. His thoughts drifted backward, to nights overseas when laughter had sounded much the same, too loud, too brittle, masking fear. He remembered the men who mocked caution, who stepped into open ground because cover seemed unnecessary. Some of them never made it back. He wondered, not for the first time, how many lessons people had to relearn before they stuck. Shadow lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes half closed but ears alert. The dog lifted his head whenever the wind surged, a low rumble of approval vibrating in his chest when the structure held firm. Frank reached down, fingers brushing coarse fur, grounding himself in the present. He wasn't building for admiration. He was building because winter didn't care what people believed. By the end of the week, the laughter had almost disappeared. Conversations shifted from ridicule to speculation, from jokes to uneasy curiosity. People began asking questions not meant to be overheard. Would it hold under real weight? Would it collapse if ice built up? Frank heard none of it directly, but he felt the change in the air, the subtle recalibration of doubt. Winter was coming harder now, and certainty was a luxury no one could afford. The chapter closed with Frank standing alone in the passage at dusk, snow swirling harmlessly around the supports below. Shadow seated beside him, steady and calm. The town still watched, still whispered, but the wind had begun to speak louder than laughter, and it was only just beginning. The storm did not arrive all at once. It crept in the way danger often does, quietly enough to be dismissed at first, politely enough that people believed they still had time. On the first night, snow fell steadily, thick flakes drifting down under the orange glow of streetlights, beautiful in a way that made Duluth seem almost gentle. Frank Miller stood on his porch long enough to feel the temperature sink further, the cold biting into his cheeks, before stepping back inside. He had seen storms like this begin before. He did not trust beauty when winter offered it. By the second night, the wind arrived. It screamed off Lake Superior like a living thing, slamming into buildings with a force that rattled windows and shook loose boards that had survived decades untouched. The sound carried through the dark like a warning siren, long and unbroken. Frank woke before dawn, not from fear but from habit, pulling on his red and black buffalo plaid jacket and moving through the cabin with measured calm. Shadow was already awake, standing near the door, ears forward, body tense but controlled. The dog's instincts were sharpened now, every muscle prepared, as if some ancient memory embedded in his blood recognized what was coming. By the third day, Duluth collapsed into stillness. Power lines went down under the weight of ice. Roads vanished beneath drifts that rose higher than car hoods. Sirens faded, then stopped altogether. Houses groaned under pressure, their roofs sagging like exhausted shoulders. Frank listened to the radio until it crackled into silence, then turned it off. He did not need updates. The storm had crossed the threshold from inconvenience into threat. Inside his passage, the world changed. The wind still roared beyond the slatted walls, but its violence was stripped of direction, broken into harmless currents that slid past without force. Snow pressed against the exterior, filling gaps without overwhelming them, the design allowing pressure to bleed away rather than build. Frank walked back and forth between the main cabin and the smaller one, boots dry, breath steady, moving as if winter were merely something to observe rather than endure. Shadow followed, nails clicking softly against wood, occasionally pausing to glance out through the slats, amber eyes tracking chaos with calm vigilance. On the fourth day, the knocking began. It was not loud at first, just a dull thud barely audible over the wind. Frank froze mid-step, listening. Shadow stiffened, a low warning rumble vibrating in his chest. Frank moved toward the door, joints protesting, heart steady. When he opened it, the storm lunged forward, snow swirling violently into the entryway before Shadow stepped into position, broad body blocking the worst of it. Sarah Whitman stood there, barely recognizable beneath layers of snow and frost. Her face, usually pale and composed, was flushed raw, lips tinged blue, chestnut hair escaping from her hood in frozen strands. She was shaking, not with panic, but with exhaustion, her tall, lean frame sagging forward as if sheer will had been holding her upright. "Our heat's gone," she managed, voice thin. "The roof over the back room collapsed. My husband's trying to clear it, but—" Her words dissolved into coughing. Frank didn't ask questions. He reached out, steadying her by the arm, guiding her inside. "Come in," he said simply. Shadow stepped aside just long enough to let her pass, then resumed his post, watching the storm as if daring it to cross the threshold again. They were not the last. Within hours, others arrived, fighting the wind in pairs, in groups, sometimes carrying children wrapped in blankets stiff with ice. An elderly man named Harold Pierce, thin as a fence post, beard yellowed by tobacco and age, arrived with his daughter, a woman in her 30s whose eyes held panic she tried and failed to hide. A young couple Frank barely knew followed, faces pinched with fear, their toddler silent against the mother's chest in a way that frightened Frank more than crying ever could. Even Tom Reeves appeared near dusk, his bravado stripped away, beard crusted with snow, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper as he admitted his furnace had failed and his roof was sagging under the weight. Frank let them all in. He moved people through the passage with quiet authority, directing them toward warmth without speeches or reassurance. The smaller cabin filled quickly, bodies packed close, breath fogging the air. Frank rationed firewood without ceremony, calculating how long supplies would last, when to stoke, when to let embers rest. Years of logistics resurfaced, uninvited but welcome. Shadow moved among the people with calm purpose, pressing his solid weight against shivering legs, allowing small hands to bury themselves in his thick fur. The dog accepted the attention without agitation, as if he understood his role extended beyond protection now into comfort. The storm raged without pause. For 5 days, the world beyond the passage ceased to matter. Snow buried doors and windows. Buildings collapsed in the distance with sounds like distant thunder. Inside the passage, the air remained cold but manageable, the difference between survival and surrender measured in degrees and design. Frank barely slept, sitting upright near the door, listening, counting breaths, replaying memories of nights spent under fire where responsibility had weighed just as heavily. He felt the old tension settle into his shoulders, the familiar burden of keeping others alive. On the 5th morning, the wind weakened. Not suddenly, but enough to be noticed. The screams fading into a low, exhausted moan. Frank stepped into the passage, shadow at his side, and looked out at a city transformed. Snowdrifts towered where streets had been. Rooflines sagged or vanished entirely. Silence pressed down heavier than the storm ever had. Behind him, people gathered, eyes wide, voices hushed. No one laughed now. No one spoke of wasted effort or foolish designs. Tom Reeves stood among them, shoulders slumped, face stripped of color, staring at the intact passage as if seeing it for the first time. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, words failing him. Frank rested his hand against the wooden post, feeling the vibration of the world settling back into place. He did not feel triumph. He felt tired. And beneath the exhaustion, something quieter. The grim satisfaction of having been right when it mattered. The storm had taken much from Duluth, but inside these walls, it had failed. When the storm finally loosened its grip, it did not leave behind relief so much as revelation. The 5 days inside Frank Miller's 2 cabins blurred together into something timeless, measured not by hours, but by breaths, by the steady rhythm of firewood being added to the stove, by the quiet movement of bodies passing through the covered passage like blood through a vein. Both cabins were crowded now, every inch claimed by people who, days earlier, had believed they would weather the winter alone. Mattresses lined the floors. Coats hung from nails meant for tools. Boots steamed by the fire, filling the air with the smell of damp leather and smoke. Frank moved through it all with the same restrained focus he had carried since the storm began. He slept in short stretches, never fully lying down, his back against the wall, his jacket still on, as if readiness itself were a form of rest. His face looked more carved than ever in the firelight, shadows deepening the lines around his eyes, his gray beard stiff with cold air and ash. People watched him when they thought he wasn't looking. The man who had once been dismissed as a stubborn old veteran now moved with the authority of someone whose instincts had been proven right when it mattered most. The fire never went out. Frank managed it with precision, feeding it just enough to keep the cabins warm without wasting fuel. He counted logs without visibly counting them, his mind working through calculations born from years of rationing under worse conditions. No one argued with his decisions. Even Tom Reeves, once so loud and dismissive, deferred now. Reeves sat hunched near the wall, his broad shoulders folded inward, his red face dulled by exhaustion and shame. His beard was still crusted with ice from the day he arrived, and when he spoke it was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. The storm had taken his roof, his furnace, and something less tangible, his certainty that bravado alone could hold back winter. Sarah Whitman became Frank's quiet counterpart. She moved among the people with practiced calm, her tall, lean frame steady despite the fatigue etched into her features. Her chestnut hair was no longer neatly tied back. Loose strands escaped constantly, brushing against her pale, wind-chapped cheeks. Her hands, long-fingered and sure, checked foreheads for fever, adjusted blankets around children, and guided the elderly into warmer corners without fanfare. The nurse in her never fully shut off, even as the woman beneath it felt the weight of fear she had suppressed since the storm began. She and Frank rarely spoke more than necessary, exchanging brief looks that carried entire conversations. Who needed warmth most? Who could wait? When to move supplies through the passage? The passage itself became something more than wood and design. People walked it carefully at first, gripping the railings, eyes wide as they felt the difference between chaos and calm with every step. Outside the slatted walls, the wind still screamed and snow swirled violently. But inside, movement felt almost sacred. Children began to treat it like a hallway in a shared home, shuffling back and forth under watchful eyes, whispering as if afraid to disturb its balance. Food was passed along it. Medicine followed. Hope did too, carried quietly, hand to hand. Shadow never left Frank's side for the long, but he expanded his patrols, moving between groups, his large body weaving through cramped spaces with surprising gentleness. At 9 years old, his movements were slower than in his prime, but his presence carried authority. His thick sable coat absorbed cold hands and tear-damp faces alike. When children cried, he settled beside them, allowing small fingers to grip his fur until sobs faded into sleep. When strangers approached Frank too quickly, Shadow positioned himself subtly between them, not threatening, just firm. No one questioned the dog's judgment. As the days wore on, stories emerged in the dim light of the cabins. People spoke of roofs collapsing in the night, of furnaces failing without warning, of the terror of realizing help would not come. Harold Pierce, the thin elderly man, told of surviving a winter storm as a boy, his voice trembling as he spoke of neighbors who hadn't made it. His daughter sat beside him, her hand wrapped around his arm, her face drawn tight with the effort of staying composed. A young father admitted he had almost stayed behind to protect his house, pride nearly costing him his child. Each confession carried the same undercurrent. Survival was not a solitary achievement. Frank listened, but rarely contributed. His memories were heavier, shaped by losses that still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. He had lost friends who trusted luck more than preparation, men who believed strength alone was enough. Sitting there now, surrounded by people alive because he had planned for the worst, he felt the old guilt stir the familiar question of why he had survived when others had not. He pushed it aside the way he always did. This was not the time for ghosts. When the storm finally broke, it did so without ceremony. The wind softened, then receded, leaving behind a silence that pressed against ears unaccustomed to peace. Frank was the first to step into the passage that morning, Shadow at his side, both moving cautiously, as if the world beyond might still lash out. What they saw stole the breath from those who followed. Snowdrifts towered where streets had once been. Buildings leaned or lay broken, their shapes barely recognizable beneath ice and debris. The neighborhood looked smaller somehow, humbled, and there, amid the destruction, Frank's 2 cabins stood intact. The passage rose cleanly above the drifts, its roof shedding snow as designed, its supports firm and unmoved. People gathered behind him, murmurs rippling through the group, disbelief giving way to awe. No one laughed. No one questioned. The structure spoke for itself. Tom Reeves stepped forward then, his boots crunching softly. He removed his hat, holding it awkwardly in his hands. His voice, when it came, was rough. "You saved us," he said, not just to Frank, but to the space itself, to the idea he had mocked. Frank met his gaze, pale blue eyes steady. He nodded once, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. As the sun struggled weakly through cloud cover, people began to understand the full scope of what had happened. The double cabin had not merely sheltered them, it had changed them. They had seen what preparation could do, what connection could mean. The passage was no longer strange. It was necessary. Frank rested his hand against the wooden post again, feeling its solidity beneath his palm. He was exhausted, his body aching in places that would not quiet for days. But beneath the fatigue lay a deep, grounding certainty. He had not built this for recognition. He had built it because winter did not negotiate, and for once that was enough. Spring arrived in Duluth without celebration. It crept in cautiously, melting the sharpest edges of winter, but leaving behind scars that would take far longer to heal. Snow receded into dirty piles along roadsides. Broken roofs were patched with mismatched boards. The lake winds softened, though they never truly disappeared. And with the thaw came something else: memory. People remembered who had survived, how they had survived, and why. Frank Miller noticed the change before anyone spoke it aloud. He saw it in the way neighbors slowed when they passed his property, no longer glancing away in embarrassment or suspicion. He heard it in the quieter voices, the careful phrasing of questions that had once been accusations. By late March, the first knock came, not from someone seeking shelter, but from someone seeking knowledge. Tom Reeves stood on Frank's porch that morning, hat in his hands, shoulders squared in an unfamiliar posture of humility. Without the weight of winter, Reeves looked older, the deep lines in his face more pronounced, his beard streaked with gray he had once ignored. "I need you to show me," he said, eyes fixed on the wooden passage behind Frank. No jokes followed, no qualifiers. Frank studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Wisdom, he knew, often arrived disguised as discomfort. Soon others followed. Some wanted to connect their homes to garages to avoid icy driveways. Others spoke of linking houses to sheds, to root cellars, to workshops. Frank listened, asked questions, and when he agreed to help, he did so on his terms. He did not draw up contracts or ask for payment. He taught. He measured alongside them, corrected mistakes patiently, explained why certain angles mattered and why shortcuts would fail. His hands guided younger hands, rough skin against smooth, old knowledge transferring quietly. Sarah Whitman was there often, observing, occasionally assisting. With winter behind her, she looked lighter somehow, though the experience had etched new seriousness into her gray eyes. Her tall, slender frame moved confidently among the small crews, passing tools, steadying ladders, offering water and quiet encouragement. She had returned to part-time nursing work, but something about the building process held her attention. She listened closely when Frank explained airflow or snow load, her mind mapping principles onto people the way it always had. Preparation saved lives, whether in a hospital or a snowstorm. Shadow aged visibly through the spring, his muzzle whitening further, his pace slower, but his presence undiminished. He accompanied Frank on every walk through the neighborhood, nails clicking softly on newly built walkways. People greeted him by name now, children offering treats with solemn respect. Shadow accepted these gestures with calm dignity, tail wagging just enough to acknowledge them. He was no longer just Frank's dog. He was a simple, quiet proof that vigilance and loyalty endured. As weeks turned into months, Duluth changed in small but undeniable ways. Covered passages appeared one by one, connecting structures like veins beneath the surface of the neighborhood. They were not identical. Some were crude, others elegant, but all carried the same principle: protection without isolation. People moved more freely, more safely. Elderly neighbors checked on one another without fear of slipping on ice. Parents walked children to school in winter without bracing themselves for the cold bite of wind. Winter no longer owned the space between buildings. Frank watched it all with measured distance. He never claimed credit. When reporters from a local paper came asking for interviews, he declined politely, redirecting them toward the work itself. He had not built the passage to be seen. He had built it to last. Wealth never came, and he never expected it. He continued wearing his red and black buffalo plaid jacket, the fabric thinning in places, the warmth unchanged. It was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Lake Superior, Frank and Sarah walked together along a newly finished passage, Shadow leading the way. The air smelled of thawed earth and sawdust. Sarah spoke quietly, reflecting on how close they had all come to disaster, how easily things could have gone differently. Frank listened, nodding. He did not romanticize survival. He respected it. When she asked why he had never tried to leave Duluth for somewhere warmer, he answered without hesitation. "Because winter tells the truth," he said. "It shows you what matters." Years later, people would still point to that first double cabin when they spoke of preparedness. Children who had slept on Frank's floor during the storm grew up understanding that strength wasn't loud, and courage didn't announce itself. The passage remained, weathered but sound, boards replaced as needed, principles unchanged. Frank grew older, slower, his limp more pronounced, Shadow eventually walking shorter distances before resting. But they continued their rounds, man and dog, through a neighborhood forever altered. When Frank passed away quietly one autumn morning, his cabin filled once more not with fear, but with gratitude. People walked the passages they had built because of him, carrying memories instead of supplies. Shadow, long gone by then, was remembered as faithfully as Frank himself. The winter would come again, as it always did. But Duluth had learned its lesson. Wisdom, once ignored, had finally been heard. In the end, this story is not just about wood, nails, or a winter that refused to show mercy. It is about a quiet kind of miracle, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or light from the sky, but with wisdom placed gently into a human heart. Perhaps that wisdom was Frank's own, shaped by hardship and loss. Or perhaps it was a whisper from God, guiding his hands long before anyone else could see the purpose. The Bible reminds us that faith is the evidence of things not seen, and sometimes God's protection shows up not as rescue, but as preparation. In our everyday lives, we are often given the same choice Frank faced: to follow the crowd, or to trust the quiet conviction that tells us to prepare, to build, to care, especially when no one else believes yet. The passage Frank built became a blessing not just for himself, but for an entire community. In the same way, the small, faithful choices we make today may one day become shelter for someone else. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need encouragement. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story reminded you of, or where you're watching from. And if you believe that faith, wisdom, and preparation still matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. May God watch over you and your loved ones, guide your steps, and place wisdom in your heart before the storm ever arrives. May He protect your home, strengthen your faith, and remind you that even in the harshest winters, you are never alone.